Hey, welcome back, everybody. Another episode of Historical. Today, we are going to talk about the Holodomor, the famine in 1930s Ukraine that killed millions of people. We're going to talk about some facts and dispel some myths. In 1932 and 1933, in one of the world's most fertile agricultural regions in the world, millions of people starved to death. Not in a desert, definitely not in a war zone, but in farmland, fields that still produced grain. People were starving. Parents watched their children weaken in homes surrounded by food they were forbidden to touch. And to make it worse, the borders were sealed around them. Villages were completely blacklisted, and you couldn't leave. You had to stay there. You had to starve. Taking even a handful of grain from land that you worked was treated as theft from the state. And theft was punishable by death. Between 3 and 5 million people died in that short period of time. And not because the earth failed, but because policy did not bend. This was the Holodomor. And it did not begin with starvation. Nope. It began with ideas. Now, to understand how this happened, we have to go back in time. We have to go back before Joseph Stalin, before Vladimir Lenin, back to the world of czars. Because for centuries, Russia was ruled by absolute monarchy. The czar ruled by what was believed to be divine authority. Hierarchy was not questioned, and obedience was survival. And most ordinary people lived under something called serfdom. And simply put, serfdom meant peasants weren't exactly slaves, but they weren't free either. They were legally tied to the land they worked. So if a noble owned that estate, you belonged to that estate. And you couldn't leave. You couldn't build an independent future anywhere. This was your life. Your labor was bound to someone else's property. That's just the way it was. And what's even more crazy is serfdom wasn't abolished until 1861. 1861. That's modern history. So by the early 1900s, millions of families were only one, maybe 2 generations removed from legal dependence. That shapes how people see authority. And reforms, they came slowly. Industrialization came very unevenly. Cities grew, factories expanded, but inequality sharpened. And pressure built quietly. And when pressure builds quietly for generations, it doesn't disappear. No, sir. It just waits and builds. And then World War I came along and shattered the system. There was a revolution in Russia. There were food shortages. There was military collapse. Economic chaos everywhere. And in 1917, the Russian monarchy fell. But there was a provisional government that tried to hold things together. And foolishly, it continued the war. But in the background, a radical faction waited. They waited for the right time to strike. And they were called the Bolsheviks. And they were led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin promised peace. Lenin promised land. And he promised bread. So he's promising, hey, We're going to live peacefully. You're going to own some land that you work, and I'm going to make sure you eat. Who doesn't want that, right? Those three words, peace, land, and bread, were strong enough to topple an entire empire. So the Bolsheviks, they seized power. And then civil war followed. And you guessed it, the Bolsheviks won. They didn't just take control. They replaced the entire structure of society. And they had lied, because private property was abolished. Industry was nationalized. And political opposition was crushed. And then language shifted. People's class became their moral identity. And if you owned land, they were highly suspect of you. And even worse, if you resisted, well, you were then labeled an enemy. And once someone is labeled an enemy, their suffering becomes much easier to justify. And after Lenin's death, a man named Joseph Stalin consolidated power. Mr. Stalin didn't do it immediately or strongly. He did it gradually, strategically. And then he pushed hard. There's a term called collectivization. And this wasn't just economic reform. It was a test. It was a test of whether a government could reshape millions of lives, and by force. And whether those millions would resist or would they break. Stalin wanted rapid industrial growth. And industrial growth required grain exports. Grain exports required total control over all of agriculture. So in true communist fashion, private farms were dissolved. Land, livestock, your independence, all surrendered to the state collectives. And resistance was the strongest in Ukraine. You see, Ukraine was fertile. It was very productive. And it was nationally conscious. And Stalin saw resistance as political defiance. So what did he do? He raised the quota on the grain exports from Ukraine. He raised them unrealistically high. And when they weren't met, more grain was taken. Everything was taken. Seed grain, winter storage stocks, people's livestock. People's homes were searched. Floors were lifted. Walls were inspected. Nothing left hidden. Hiding food was like hiding contraband. And at first, people believed this would pass. They believed that, hey, reason would return. But winter doesn't negotiate. And neither does Joseph Stalin. By late 1932, starvation had spread across central and eastern Ukraine. It was slow at first. And then there was fatigue and weakness. People were swelling from malnutrition. Children's bodies were changing right before their eyes. Energy was disappearing. And internal passports were enforced. Borders were sealed. If you tried to leave Ukraine to find food, you were turned back. You're staying here, and you're starving. And that's all there is to it. Entire villages were blacklisted, which meant they could not trade. Nobody would trade with them. There was no supplies, zero outside help. But still, all their grain was exported. Food existed for these people. It was just removed. And most serious historical estimates place the death toll between 3 and 5 million people in less than 2 years. Wow. 3 to 5 million people in villages, in farmhouses, in silence. Some regions lost nearly a quarter of their entire populations. Reports back then describe empty homes, unburied bodies laid out everywhere. Children wandered alone. There are documented accounts of cannibalism. And I say that carefully, not to shock you, but because when a society reaches that point, you understand the depth of collapse. This wasn't random famine like a natural disaster tore up all the crops or a war or anything like that. It wasn't random. This was enforced starvation under centralized authority. And the purpose? Simple. Break resistance, crush Ukrainian autonomy, force compliance, secure the grain, and control. Control was the engine, and millions of people paid the price. And here's what history does sometimes. It takes something catastrophic like the Holodomor and turns it into a weapon for something else. So enter the Nazis. While Ukraine was starving, in Germany, a narrative was being built. Under Adolf Hitler, the Nazis promoted a phrase, and that phrase is Judeo-Bolshevism. And let's be clear, very clear, that term was invented propaganda. It wasn't real. It's not real. It was not a documented movement. It was formed as a political weapon because it fused anti-Semitism with fear of communism. Two things Hitler hated. Were some early Bolsheviks Jews? Absolutely. Leon Trotsky, for example, he was born into a Jewish family. That's undeniable. It's a historical fact. But the part people always leave out is Bolshevism was aggressively atheist. It shut down churches. It shut down synagogues. It suppressed religion across the board. Millions and millions of Jews suffered under Stalin, just like Christians or anybody else. But conveniently, this Nazi myth of Judeo-Bolshevism ignored that. And it ignored it because Hitler and the term isn't trying to explain. It was trying to mobilize fear. Even today, you'll hear people say Hitler was right. Usually it comes from fear. Fear about instability, fear about change, fear about losing control. Nobody likes those feelings. And when people feel uncertain, bringing certainty feels powerful. Extreme ideologies offer simple villains. They offer simple answers. Things like, they're the problem. Remove them. Things will stabilize after that. And that simplicity feels strong. But it's important to realize simple isn't the same thing as true. They're different. Simplicity and truth are not the same. The myth of Judeo-Bolshevism justified invasion. It justified genocide. It turned anxiety into aggression. When fear drives interpretation, history becomes a weapon instead of a lesson. It's important to know the Holodomor was not Jews versus Christians. It's often framed that way because that helps the Nazi ideology. What the Holodomor really was centralized power enforcing ideological control. And if we reduce it to a myth, then we miss the real mechanism here. And if we miss the mechanism, we're more likely to miss it again and again and again. You see, the Holodomor didn't begin with starving children. It began with language shifting, with quotas rising, with labels of, replacing people's names. A farmer became a kulak. A village became suspect. And an entire region becomes problematic. And once people became categories, they become easier to sacrifice. No one wakes up in the morning planning atrocity. No one wakes up and says, man, I really feel like partaking in some sort of mass atrocity today. Like, that sounds wonderful. No, they wake up complying. They wake up thinking they're protecting order. And step by step, the line moves until one day, millions are gone in silence, in winter, in fields that still grew grain. If this episode made you uncomfortable, it should. Because history isn't meant to feel safe. Not at all. It's meant to feel honest. Everything discussed in this episode is grounded in historical documentation. There is a full source list and recommended reading available in the show notes. Just if you want to go deeper, that's a place to start. But these stories aren't rumors. They're recorded. And they matter. And if you're sitting here thinking, wow, what did I just listen to? Good. That's good. That means it landed, which is the goal. My goal here is never, ever to tell you what to think. I don't like being told what to think. I just want these stories to make you think. My name's Jonathan. I go by historical. And I tell history stories that refuse to be forgotten.